Hi, my name is Kelp, and this is The Lion of Poetry. Now, there have been several instances throughout history of married couples where both the husband and the wife were poets. But perhaps the most famous married couple in the world of poetry, living in England at the height of the Victorian age, were the Brownings, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her husband, Robert Browning. Now, Elizabeth gained success and recognition as a poet early in her life. She was also unwell with various ailments from early in her life. By 1844, when she was in her mid-30s, she was one of the most popular poets in all of England, which drew the attention of the young Robert Browning, who at that point was an unknown. As the story goes, he has fallen in love with her from reading her poems, so he begins to write to her. And they have this correspondence that goes on for over a year, which blossoms into a love affair. And against the wishes of her domineering father, Elizabeth Barrett marries this unknown poet, Robert Browning, in 1846. Very romantic. She is consequently disinherited by her father, but undeterred, the couple moves to Italy, where cost of living is cheaper, and where both of them write poems for the rest of their lives, which didn't turn out to be too long for Elizabeth. Because of her various illnesses, she died in 1861. Robert wound up surviving her by nearly 30 years, never remarrying, but going on to become, in his later life, a great poet in his own right. Now, you know Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Here is her most famous poem, which you may never have heard in its entirety. I confess that I hadn't until I prepared this episode. Here it is. Enjoy it.
How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being in ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
The poem is, of course, one of the greatest love poems in the English language. It's in the sonnet form. Now, the sonnet is 14 lines. It does have the definite rhyme scheme, and the poem can be split into two parts. The first 8 lines, which speak of the poet's love in the present. And of course, she's counting the ways that she loves him. And this love is boundless and knows no limits. Then there's the final 6 lines of the poem, which speak to the poet's love in the past and in the future. The poem ends with the poet asserting that even her death will not deter her love. In fact, she will love even better after death, because it basically means that her love is for eternity. Now, Elizabeth wrote this poem for Robert. So you might ask, who is this guy who could inspire such a passionate poem? Well, he was indeed a pretty good guy. Both Brownings, husband and wife, were activists in their day. Both were opposed to slavery, both supporters of women's rights and humanism in general. Robert Browning was vocally opposed to anti-Semitism, which was prevalent particularly in England at that time, and was opposed to the persecution of Jews, which was prevalent particularly in Russia at that time. Browning wrote a poem called Rabbi Ben Ezra, which he famously begins, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be," which may have been inspired by his relationship with Moses Montefiore, who was perhaps the most prominent Jew of that time. In terms of poetry in general, Browning wrote many enduring poems, including The Pied Piper of Hamelin, which has become a perennial favorite among children. But Browning is most known as the master of the dramatic monologue, where the poem consists of a single narrator giving a speech to a silent listener. The poem that I want to share with you is called My Last Duchess. Because the language is a bit difficult, let's read it together in small pieces, bit by bit, and explain it as we go along. A couple of quick notes about the poem itself. You'll notice that the poem is a rhyming poem. It's rhymed couplets. So we have as the last word of each line, wall, call, hands, stands, said, read, etc. But what's so brilliant about this poem is that you don't even hear the rhymes. You would expect it to sound like a kind of sing-song, but notwithstanding the high Victorian language, it actually sounds pretty natural. The poem sounds very colloquial. The meter of the poem is also the classic iambic pentameter, which is the meter of Shakespeare. It's basically 10 beats in the line. In this poem, the narrator is the Duke of Ferrara, a city in Italy. The Duke is a character created by Browning, who is definitely not Browning himself. In fact, we'll see Browning was probably quite repulsed by this character. Now, it's called a dramatic monologue. There's a drama in this poem that unfolds as the poem goes on, and more gets revealed about the story, and also more and more gets revealed about the Duke's personality. My Last Duchess, Ferrara. That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. We'll stop here. Fra Pandolf is the painter of this painting, and the narrator, the Duke of Ferrara, is showing this painting to this, so far we don't know who it is he's showing it to, an unknown person. And the painting is a painting of his last Duchess, which is his previous wife, who we'll soon find out is no longer alive. Let's continue. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. So let's stop there. So he's saying to this listener that he specifically said Fra Pandolf, maybe as a way of name dropping, because maybe Fra Pandolf was a kind of a famous painter, but also he is saying to the person there that anyone who's seen this painting in the past, strangers like you, that pictured this countenance, meaning that had seen the face of my Duchess, my last wife, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. So there's a depth and passion in the painting and perhaps in the personality of the Duchess herself, but always turn to him because, as he says, there's a curtain that usually covers this painting. Now that's odd unto itself, is that this painting is usually covered. There's a curtain in front of it, and he's the only one who can open up the curtain and show the painting. So there's a kind of a control thing going on here. He controls the access to this painting, but it's also a bit bizarre that there's a curtain there. Anyway, anyone who sees this painting that he pulls back the curtain for them to see would always ask how such a glance got there. How is this, what's going on in the face of the Duchess that seems to be captured by this painter Fra Pandolf? So continuing, Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. There's something joyous in the cheek of the Duchess, that blush of joy, again, Fra Pandolf has somehow captured. And she would blush and smile in the Duke's presence, but not only in the Duke's presence. And the painter himself may have been paying too much attention to her. The details of how her hands were laying, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. In other words, her hands are covered too much. Or he's trying to bring out some kind of color in her throat, so he seems to be looking at her throat. And this kind of bothers the Duke, that perhaps the painter, Fra Pandolf, is a bit too attentive to the Duchess, who is the Duke's wife. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Everyone seemed to impress the Duchess. She was happy in everyone's presence. She was a kind of a positive, good-natured person, it seems. The Duke was not very happy with that. He was jealous. He really wanted her to have all of her attention on him and not on anyone else. Sir, 'twas all one, my favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west. The boughs of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked them, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. There's some examples here of things that kind of ticked off the Duke. Someone brought her cherries. She was happy riding around on her mule. All of these things would make her happy. The Duke only wanted himself to be the source of her happiness. He wanted her to appreciate the privilege of being married to him with his sense of royalty and pedigree. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. O sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? It's this growing animosity that is slowly being revealed. He finds his wife too friendly, too happy with everyone, and not open to his pointers or his mentorship, saying just this or that and you disgust me. His efforts to perfect her or to change her character sort of went on deaf ears. She was just happy-go-lucky in her ways. She smiled whenever he passed, but she smiled at whoever passed. Then we come to the climax in the poem. This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Meaning, this got to the point where he couldn't take it anymore. He gave some commands, and she was executed or killed. And he's just saying this to this person listening, who must now have his mouth open to the floor from listening to this. There she stands, as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So now we have another revelation here. We see now who this person is that he's talking to. He's saying to him, will you stand up, please? Will you rise? And let's go down and go to the other company. It turns out that this person that he's talking to is a representative or works for the Count. Now, who is the Count? The Count is another presumably wealthy person whose daughter the Duke is interested in marrying. So that's why this person who's listening to this story was sent to the Duke as an emissary from the Count, whose daughter is potentially going to be marrying the Duke. So imagine the impression that he has now, that this representative of the Count has about the Duke. This is a man who's very jealous, very controlling, with no compunctions, can kill his wife, and now he's interested in marrying the daughter of the Count. And not only that, but he's talking about the Count, sort of talking him up. The Count, your master's known munificence. And he's saying, I know that there'll be ample amount of dowry. A dowry, of course, is the amount of money that will be given with his daughter as part of the marriage arrangement. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. The Duke is saying, be great to have a big dowry, but really, it's the daughter herself. That's my object. I'm in love with her, dowry or not, but it would be nice to have a good dowry. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. So he says, wait up. I'm going to come with you down the steps and we'll go to the company together. Again, you can imagine what state of shock this listener is in to hear this story being revealed about how he has murdered his last spouse. and now is courting the Count's daughter. As they're going down the stairs to join the other guests, just as a last aside, he says, "Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." He's pointing, as they're going down the stairs, to a bronze sculpture of Neptune, the god of the sea, taming a seahorse. And this is a good metaphor for the Duke himself, who is controlling and taming, treating his Last Duchess like an animal that to be tamed. And so we have the drama of this poem, which reveals this psychotic man who is probably the antithesis of Robert Browning himself. This poem reads like a B-movie. It's almost a horror movie with a true-to-life monster. But the themes in this poem certainly resonate in our own day and age. One could read this poem as a cautionary tale of the abuse of male power. Browning wrote dozens of these dramatic monologues. These are very popular pieces that people would enjoy reading together in groups. And so we see that in the latter part of the Robert Browning's life and after his death, up until fairly recently, there have been throughout the world, certainly in England and in the US, what were called Browning societies. People getting together and reading the poetry of Robert Browning and enjoying the revelatory nature of these great poems. So I hope you enjoyed the poetry of both Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The Lion of Poetry.